Once again, the media is predicting a complete collapse of the Chinese economy with more and more alarming headlines. Though it might be absolutely ridiculous to expect the collapse of over 3,000 years of historical and economic development in a month or two, there are clear indications that all is not well with the Chinese economy. The latest and most disturbing is the recent bursting of the property bubble, an industry that accounts for 30% of China's economy. This is intricately intertwined with the country's excessive debt problem and the grinding down of the economy due to the Chinese Communist Party's terrible zero-COVID policy. As of April 2022, China had a debt-to-GDP ratio of 264%. It is expected to climb even higher this year because of the continuous COVID lockdowns. According to the World Bank, countries that maintained a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 77% for prolonged periods of time experienced economic slowdowns and often had to cut funds allocated to crucial sectors such as healthcare and education. In addition, the higher a country's debt-to-GDP ratio is, the higher its likelihood of defaulting on its debt, plunging the markets into widespread panic and chaos. But that is just one of the many problems of the Chinese economy. Citizens are angry and completely demoralized by the government's extreme lockdown policies. Even one asymptomatic patient could send a whole region into a complete lockdown. That is the extent the CCP is going to enforce its zero-COVID policy. Most economic hubs are now ghost towns with very little economic activities. In addition, China has also recorded lower than expected economic growth in the second quarter of 2022. But there is a bigger crisis brewing in the country's banking and real estate industries. For over a month now, protesters have been gathering in front of the Jingyu branch of the People's Bank of China in the provincial capital of Henan, demanding their frozen life savings, which the banks have refused to release. These savers simply went to the ATM to withdraw their savings and realized they couldn't, without any prior warnings. As of press time, tens of billions of yuan from over 400,000 citizens have been frozen. The crisis in the banking industry is also tied to the property bubble burst. The banks borrowed at high rates to fund property developers, but as that sector went belly up, the smaller banks realized they had a crisis on their hands. This is largely due to the monetary multiplier effect, which occurs when banks lend more than they hold in their deposits and the increase in the money supply exceeds the amount of the initial deposit due to the fractional reserve banking system. Take a look at this chart, which shows how a bank can increase the money supply to over $5,000 from one $1,000 deposit. Here, we have an initial deposit of $1,000 and a 15% reserve requirement, which means banks only keep 15% of the deposits they receive. So, person deposits $1,000 to a bank, which keeps $150 in its reserves and lends out $850 to person B. Person B spends the money, and it becomes person C's asset, which they deposit into their own savings account. The bank will receive the same $850, keep $127.50 for its reserves, and lend out $722.50. There has now been an $850 increase in the money supply, but it's not an actual increase because the banks created the money from thin air. But they don't stop there. They continue to receive and lend out money, creating more money out of thin air from the initial $1,000 deposit. Chinese banks are not the only banks that are over-leveraged. This is happening in every corner of the world. So, what happened to these smaller Chinese banks? Why couldn't they give money to savers? As mentioned earlier, it was because of the property bubble burst. The over-leveraged banks had overextended themselves by lending too much money to property developers who had no way to pay back. As such, they didn't have any money to return to savers. When people realized this, the crisis worsened because everyone was trying to withdraw their savings at once. But this money was created out of thin air, as we've explained, and the banks just couldn't pay back the money. There have also been reports of a large bank scam perpetuated by a private investment holding company with stakes in the 4 rural banks in the central province of Henan and one in Anhui. An official probe into the case found that Henan's Inkefu Group investment holding company colluded with bank employees to take deposits and marketed financial products via online platforms before transferring the money by fabricating lending agreements. In the province, banks were either creating money out of thin air or causing money to disappear into thin air. The China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission has also announced that savings connected to the scam have not been insured. According to official reports, the crisis started with 5 banks, but will rapidly spread to more banks as more savers lose confidence in the Chinese banking industry. But how vast is the property bubble burst that it has crippled the whole banking sector of a region in China? We will provide a detailed explanation in the other half of this video. But we have a small request before we proceed. Please share and like this video. Drop your comments and observations below and subscribe to the channel. Everything helps with the YouTube algorithm, so we can continue to bring you these videos. Thanks for your continued support. As stated earlier, there is an intricate connection between the crisis in the real estate industry and the banking sector. When depositors couldn't withdraw their money, depositors decided to take a drastic measure. Tens of thousands of homeowners threatened to stop paying mortgages primarily because they were mainly paying for unfinished housing projects. Much like the rest of the world, Chinese people attach a lot of importance to home ownership. As such, property prices have continued to climb faster over the years. To avoid paying too much for a finished property or missing out entirely, citizens have been using a property pre-sale model, where they pay mortgages on unfinished housing projects. This model worked for some time but failed with the pandemic-induced economic downturn of 2020 and 2021. But it was also largely due to the greed of property developers. They developed a kind of Ponzi scheme where they collected money from new market entrants to complete existing projects. With the economic decline, they didn't have enough money from prospective buyers to complete existing projects. They bailed on deadlines, and many projects remained unfinished. This caused the collapse of giant developer Evergrande last year, with a huge $300 billion debt pile. These giant developers were only collecting money from people without delivering their projects. According to recent reports, only 60% of pre-sale homes between 2013 and 2020 were actually built. Coupled with the bank scam and freezing up of around $6 billion worth of savings, homeowners simply decided to stop paying mortgages en masse. Hundreds of thousands of home buyers stopped paying over $300 billion worth of mortgages, which caused more freezing of savings as banks sought to retaliate. In late July, a government official said the government would launch a $44 billion rescue fund to resolve the crippling debt crisis and restore confidence in China's real estate industry. But that has not done much to alleviate the concerns and protests about the heavily indebted sector. Data from China Real Estate Information Corporation, a Chinese research firm, suggests that the mortgage strikes are affecting more than 100 residential property projects in 50 cities. It is also estimated that some 4 trillion yuan or $600 billion of debt is at stake. Home sales are also showing little signs of recovery. Between January and May, property sales were down almost 25% compared to the same period in 2021. Deng Wang, a chief economist at a bank in Shanghai, had this to say about the real estate crisis. 80% of China's residential housing was built with prepaid schemes. So, even if the central bank would like to salvage the sector, it would be impossible to do so without lowering mortgage rates. The S&P rating agency also estimates that 10 to 30% of local and regional governments will need bailing out by the central government or risk defaulting on their debts by the end of the year. Unpaid mortgages, nasty COVID lockdowns, a drastically slowing economy, a terrible property bubble burst, and frozen bank deposits. That is the current reality of the Chinese economy, teetering badly on the verge of a collapse. Something has to give before we can begin to talk about a possible recovery, most likely the COVID lockdowns. But the CPC does not seem willing to toe that path, and it is only a matter of time before the collapse spreads to and cripples other sectors. What do you think about the current crisis in the Chinese economy? Please drop your comments and observations in the comments section below. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. As a small channel, we need all the help we can get. So please subscribe, turn on post notifications, and check out our other videos. Thanks for watching.